we can, we'll begin. It is an honor for me to introduce Ralph McInerney to this gathering. However, I note a certain absurdity involved in the introduction. As a former student of Ralph's, I recall one of the first things I learned from him was the Aristotelian maxim that in learning, one does not proceed from the lesser known to the better known. So here I stand, for good reason, unknown to almost all of you, introducing a man whom most of you do know. For that reason, I will not recount to you anything approaching all of the extraordinary achievements of Ralph's 49 years of service to Our Lady's University. I will not recall for you the extraordinary scholarly achievements, among which are such classics as Aquinas and Analogy, Boethius and Aquinas, Ethica to Mystica, Aquinas against the Averroists, Art and Prudence, Aquinas on Human Action, and his marvelous Gifford lectures, Characters in Search of Their Author. Nor will I remind you of his role as general editor of the collected works in English of Jacques Maritain. I won't recollect for you the novels, like The Priest, Red Hat, Gate of Heaven, A Narrow Time, and the Rogerson trilogy, or the detective series like Father Dowling and Sister Mary Teresa, or the Notre Dame mysteries. Perhaps because Ralph has recently added yet another course to his large repertoire on the philosophical poets, I will mention his poetry, such as the Shakespearean variations. How about the many honors that have been bestowed upon him? The Fulbrights, the honorary degrees, visiting professorships, the Aquinas Medal of the American Catholic Philosophical Association, membership on the Pontifical Academy of St. Thomas, or the President's Committee on Arts and Humanities. No, I do not intend to remind you of those. Our conference is on formation and renewal, so I want to introduce to you Ralph McInerney, the teacher. Many of us here are teachers of one sort or another, and it is through teaching that we form our students and renew ourselves. Ralph has been teaching students for 50 years. I was privileged to be a student of his for 5 of those years, spending almost every working day in his company in the Maritain Center on the 7th floor of the Hesburgh Library. When I think of that time, I recall Ralph's most recent book, The Very Spiritual Hours of Jacques Maritain, just published this week by the University of Notre Dame Press, and I believe just put on the tables out in the room out there. Read this book. Better buy as well. In this marvelous spiritual portrait of the great 20th century Thomist, Ralph demonstrates that amidst that tumultuous century and the many winds of change that blew through Maritain's life, at least one thing remained always constant in him. His Christian faith is captured in Leon Bloy's statement that there is but one sadness, not to be among the saints. Ralph demonstrates how that truth was no mere intellectual assent, but rather that it thoroughly animated Maritain's concern for those around him, certainly in their intellectual and artistic pursuits, but also in all aspects of their lives. Indeed, Ralph returns to Bloy's statement so often in the course of the book that one cannot help but believe it is because he takes it to be his own guiding light. No student of Ralph McInerney's could ever believe that there is an insuperable conflict between the demands of an academic vocation and living a good and decent family life, filled with the joy of children and lasting friendships. Certainly, Ralph would drop his own work to discuss and argue with you for sometimes 2 or more hours about medieval theories of significatio, suppositio, and the modus significandi, and so on. But in addition to this intellectual formation, those of us who were his students knew that generally in the daily ups and downs of trying to finish our work, in the sorrows and the joys, he commiserated with us and laughed with us. He found ways of supporting us and our growing families. Above all, he prayed for us. The Jesuits call this generosity of soul, cura personalis, care of the whole person. Indeed, I would point out that along with Cardinal George, Ralph began his teaching career at the Jesuit Creighton University. My father was also a teacher, and he used to tell me that there are only 3 essential structures at a Catholic university: the church with its sanctuary, the classroom building with its chalkboards, and the library with its books. Here at Notre Dame, no doubt we must add the grotto with its candles. But for me and mine, we will always add that blessed place on the 7th floor of the library with its teacher. So I want to introduce to you Ralph McInerney, the teacher, director of the center, and spiritual brother of Jacques Maritain. His title is The Road Not Taken.
Thank you, John. Thank you, John. Can you hear me? I can't hear me. When you get my age, any introduction sounds like an obituary. In War and Peace, Tolstoy says that great generals acquire their reputation more because their orders are not followed than because they are. Indeed, in telling the epic story of the invasion of Russia by Napoleon and then his humiliating withdrawal, Tolstoy seems finally to remove the course of events from the intentions and executions of mere human agents. In the course of battle, no one really knows what's going on, nor how what he does affects the outcome. Ambrose Bierce said much the same thing about the Civil War, in which he served for 4 years with the Indiana Regiment. For Tolstoy, at least, the mysterious hand of providence, an explanation which is not an explanation in any ordinary sense, is the real agent of history. Well, I'm no Tolstoy, and my topic is somewhat less sweeping than War and Peace. But I have come to feel that his notion applies as much to the growth and development of institutions like Notre Dame as it does to huge political and military events. Telling how our university has come to be what it is not a narrative of carefully thought out plans wisely executed. Of course, there are plans and executions too, though not always in the sense one might momentarily wish. But when one looks back over the years from here to earlier, clear causal lines, enacted clear intentions do not appear. I want to talk about some very interesting people who were here on this campus half a century ago, or more or less, who gave a great deal of thought to the kind of university Notre Dame should be. I will give you some sense of their vision of the place. And as I do, you are likely to think, as I do, how oddly different things are than they imagined they might become. What would Notre Dame have been like if their dreams were realized? What I have to say should not be taken to be criticism of those who have brought us to where we are, not least because, like Tolstoy, I think what has happened is only tangentially related to what was intended. I myself have been here for half a century, and in the course of the years have played a minor spear carrier role in the campus operatic drama. Tenors have voiced their arias, divas have burst into song, alarms and skirmishes have rearranged the stage from time to time, but the fat lady has yet to sing. We are not living in the end times, but simply in the present. If I were an historian, I might recount early seeming turning points in the life of the university. There was the famous divergence of viewpoint between Father Morrissey and Father Zahm in the late 19th century, with the latter underscoring the need to recruit a distinguished faculty that would justify the claim to be a university. Zahm may be said to have exemplified in his own career what he had in mind. Weber's Life of Zahm is the basic source, of course, but one need not be an historian to see the continued influence of Father Zahm here, notably in the Dante collection, which was built around his personal library, though it has, of course, expanded exponentially since. Zahm may be said to have lost the debate with Morrissey, thus postponing the institutional maturity of Notre Dame. More speculatively, there is the earlier long wooing of Orestes Brownson by Father Sorin, who tried unsuccessfully to bring the great convert and religious controversialist to Notre Dame. Kent Emery, for one, has wondered what Notre Dame might have become if Brownson had succumbed to the blandishments of Father Sorin. Anyone who reads Brownson's autobiographical The Convert can imagine what this place might have been with such a firebrand among us. As it happened, it was only some years after his death that Brownson was finally brought to Notre Dame, to his final resting place in the main aisle of the crypt of Sacred Heart. The Latin legend on the slab over his grave all but effaced by the passage of many feet going forward to receive communion. Well, I am no historian, of course, and what I have to say is inevitably impressionistic and personal. When I joined the faculty in 1955, I was given an office in the main building that I shared with Phil Gleason, later to be a recipient of the Laetare Medal, Henri Dulac, a priest from St. Paul, who spent 2 years at Notre Dame after a sabbatical at Yale, and Willis Nutting of the then General Program of Liberal Education. It was Willis and I who discovered in a walk-in vault in the corner of our office, built into one of the pillars supporting the Golden Dome, packages containing a novel by Knut Rockne. The title is The Four Winners: The Hand, the Feet, the Head, and the Ball. And we chuckled about it until I noticed the dedication to Arnold McInerney. But it's not for this that I mentioned Willis Nutting. In 1948, Willis published a book called How Firm a Foundation, in which he contrasts the philosophy he had been taught in a secular graduate school and his new outlook as a convert to Catholicism. The book is suffused with the conviction that the faith provides a context within which the life of the mind must be conducted, and when it is, the results will be different. It is this assumption about the ambience of a Catholic university which animated a series of attempts to bring the university closer to what it should be. Oddly enough, one of the principal loci of bringing distinguished Catholic scholars to the campus was the mathematics department, where Karl Minger sought to provide a counterbalance to the Vienna Circle, and to which he brought Kurt Gödel. But it was rather in philosophy and in literature that this effort continued. John T. Frederick of the English department had an enormous influence on the way in which literature was taught. And two young professors in that department inaugurated a sequence in the philosophy of Catholic literature. They were Rufus Rauch and the legendary Frank O'Malley. In philosophy, the advent of Yves Simon got the graduate program underway. And there was also the pervasive influence of Jacques Maritain on the university, although he was never a member of the faculty. It is a note of these years that there was a link to the critique of higher education that had been launched by Robert Hutchins and Mortimer Adler and others. The attempt to restore a liberal education based on the great books quite naturally then looked to Catholic colleges as places where at least a vestige of such education remained. But the influence between Hutchins et al. And Notre Dame was reciprocal. The program of liberal studies, originally called, as I mentioned, the General Program of Liberal Education, was a focal point. Otto Bird, the first director of the General Program, published a memoir a few years ago called The Center Does Not Hold, a memoir not anecdotal enough for my taste. Otto was a product of the Medieval Institute at Toronto, and he once told me that Etienne Gilson had defined the purpose of the Institute to produce people who could read Dante intelligently. The ideal of a liberal education tied to the great books was intended not to be, originally it was not intended to be a sort of specialty in the College of Arts and Letters, competitive with departments, but to be the yeast which would eventually transform the whole college in the light of the great books. Well, needless to say, that did not happen. Father Kavanaugh, who preceded Father Hesburgh as president, brought Otto here, and after his retirement as president, Father Kavanaugh himself taught in the General Program, thus witnessing the non-realization of the original intention of the program. There may be no better way to gain a sense of the Notre Dame to which I am referring than to read Ed Fisher's Notre Dame Remembered, published in 1987, and Tom Stritch's My Notre Dame, published in 1991. The first is dedicated to Father Hesburgh. The second concludes with a chapter entitled President Hesburgh. Both books are retrospects. Fisher's more strictly personal than Stritch's. Stritch's book is particularly interesting for its recalling what he calls the Burns-Schumacher revolution, academic revolution of the 1920s. Burns was president, Schumacher dean of arts and letters, and among their cohorts was Father Miltner of the philosophy department, who had received his degree from Laval in Quebec. This revolution was a prelude to the faculty recruited in 1930. John T. Frederick, whom I mentioned, and Richard Sullivan of the English department loom large in this account, as do the poets Frederick Nems and Ernest Sandin. The two fathers Ward, Leo L. and Leo R., they were known as Leo Literary and Leo Rational because one was in the English department and the other in the philosophy department. They played crucial roles. It was at this time that Frank O'Malley became, in Stritch's words, the center and showpiece of the English department. There is an edgy ambivalence in Stritch's estimate of the emphasis that O'Malley placed on Catholic writers. He calls O'Malley's approach confessional and dangerous, and writes, "Literature, no less than history, should never be made merely confessional." And certainly Frank overvalued the specifically Catholic writers he dealt with, Blois, Péguy, Mauriac, Claudel, and others. Nevertheless, it was a danger worth risking at the passionate and brilliant O'Malley level. It's quintessentially Stritchian to put down Bois, Péguy, Mauriac, etc. Stritch himself was director of American Studies, a program he founded, and he took pride in having directed attention to the, as he puts it, mainstream of American literature and vernacular American writing. We have here, I think, in benign form, a contrast between 2 points of view, one of which has more or less faded from the scene, the other emerging as dominant. By thus marginalizing the Catholic authors O'Malley celebrated, relegating them to the banks of the mainstream, Stritch unwittingly opened the way for developments he came to deplore. I remember his mordant summarizing comment about Notre Dame. "This isn't the cruise I signed on for." O'Malley published little, although for many years he edited the Review of Politics. John Meany's O'Malley of Notre Dame is an essential source. Frank's was a corrective effort, a kind of internal critique. What was wanting, he thought, was a more robust sense of the relevance of the faith for the work of the university. Christopher Dawson's thesis that culture is essentially connected with religion was an article of the O'Malley faith. But if O'Malley wanted more of what he felt was weak in our effort, his notion that the faith makes a difference to the way the work of the university is conducted was shared by all the earlier proponents of reform. Doubtless this was why, when luminaries were recruited for the faculty, they were almost invariably Catholics. The acquisition of Yves Simon and the long association of Notre Dame with Jacques Maritain provided a counterpart in philosophy to what O'Malley was doing in literature. Maritain, like Willis Nutting, viewed the so-called mainstream in philosophy as fatally flawed, and his Thomism amounted to a corrective alternative. One of his early works was called Anti-Moderne, and one of his last, The Peasant of the Garonne, denied the very name philosopher to prominent post-war thinkers. Leo R. Ward was a member of the philosophy department, as I mentioned. I first met him at a meeting of the Metaphysical Society that was held at the University of Chicago in the spring of 1955, just before I joined the faculty here. When my mentor at the University of Minnesota, Paul Homer, heard I was coming to Notre Dame, his first reaction was to mention Father Ward. In the archives of the university, you can find a prospectus for graduate studies in philosophy, drawn up by Father Ward, in which he urges the hiring of Simon. In 1949, he published Blueprint for a Catholic University. Like Nutting, Ward published many books, but this is easily his most important. Moreover, it provides a vision which, alas, was not to be realized. What characterizes his book, as it characterized O'Malley and Nutting and Bird and Menger, is the conviction that being a Catholic is relevant to the academic work of the university. Not surprisingly, Ward devotes many pages to Newman's idea of a university. What he himself is after is what makes a university Catholic. I think his proposed answer may be seen as a version of what Maritain meant by Christian philosophy. In 1933, the French Thomist Society met at Juvisy outside Paris to discuss the question of Christian philosophy. Their interest, the meeting had been triggered by an essay by Émile Brehier, the historian of philosophy, in which he asked, "Y a-t-il une philosophie chrétienne?" And the answer was no. He maintained the all too familiar thesis that a believer cannot be a real philosopher. Why? Because he already holds answers to the large question. How can he follow the argument wherever it goes if he already knows the desired destination? The assumption of this critique is that real philosophers conduct their inquiries in a total absence of presuppositions or lived convictions. And this, of course, entails that the real philosopher is non-existent. At the Juvisy meeting, Père Mondonnet, the great medievalist, rejected the notion of Christian philosophy. He did so on the basis of the formal distinction between philosophy and theology, such that for philosophy to be influenced by the faith would be for it to become theology. Maritain eventually wrote a little book. He was not at that meeting at Juvisy except in terms of a constant reference to him. He wrote a little book after that meeting called Christian Philosophy, in which he made a crucial distinction between the nature of philosophy and its state. Joseph Pieper similarly distinguished philosophy from philosophizing, die Philosophierung. For the believer, faith provides the existential ambience within which he philosophizes. How could it not be so? And the same may be said of all the academic disciplines. A truth of faith could not play an intrinsic role in a philosophical argument, but it plays an essential role in doing philosophy, literature, history, mathematics, law, whatever. The influence of faith on intellectual work is both negative and positive, providing the antecedent hunch that certain positions are flawed if they conflict with faith, and positive in that the faith spurs one's research. All this has been recalled by Pope John Paul II in his encyclical Fides et Ratio. On the occasion of the 150th anniversary of Notre Dame, I was asked to write an account of my department. It may have been the first time I had devoted much reflection to the context in which I was living my academic life. Well, not quite the first. In 1966, I published a little book called Thomism in an Age of Renewal. Like most books, this was not one I had intended to write. It grew out of an article I had written for America, which caught the eye of Jack Bernard, an editor at Doubleday, and he asked me if I would be interested in developing the theme of the article into a book. Apparently I was. In it, I addressed the widespread notion that Vatican II had jettisoned the tradition of Catholic philosophy, whose paladin is Thomas Aquinas. I was hired half a century ago because I had written my dissertation on Kierkegaard, to whose work I had been introduced by Paul Homer at the University of Minnesota. The department then saw itself as composed of members who shared a common core, call it Thomism of one version or another, but related it to other developments in philosophy. The aim was to create a new synthesis or amalgam of traditionally acquired truths and whatever of truth is to be found elsewhere. When I read my account to my colleagues in the department, most of them found this ideal alien. It had certainly long been shelved. How did this come about? If any single publication may be said to have called into question Notre Dame's earlier searches for excellence, it is John Tracy Ellis's 1955 American Catholics and the Intellectual Life, which you can find discussed in Phil Gleason's Keeping the Faith, American Catholicism Past and Present, published in 1987. Ellis effectively stated that Catholic higher education was a failure, and an indication of this was the lack of prestige of Catholic scholar. What Gleason calls the missionary spirit was said to characterize past efforts, and this had led to a lack of seriousness in the pursuit of truth. The response to Ellis's essay was phenomenal. Its chief influence was to make the secular estimate of Catholic higher education regulative of success. If one desired excellence, he must look to where it was presumably exemplified, namely in the prestigious non-Catholic universities. No more fateful turn was ever taken, not only by Notre Dame, but by almost every other Catholic college and university in this country. Well, how describe the contrast between this attitude and that shared by O'Malley and all the others whom I have mentioned? It was not that they, unlike Ellis, thought everything was hunky-dory in the Catholic university, but if amelioration was sought, it was to be of a specifically Catholic kind. Ellis, on the other hand, seemed to endorse the view that the criteria for success were to be sought elsewhere. Apparently absent from this suggestion was any recognition of the endemic hostility to the faith and to Catholicism in universities regarded as prestigious. Locally, Notre Dame began to be explicitly measured against its secular counterparts, notably the Ivy League. There is irony in this. It would not be long before the kind of criticism of what was going on in those prestigious institutions would become a minor scholarly industry. There was, of course, Allen Bloom's The Closing of the American Mind, with its devastating descriptions of the Cornell in Chicago, where he had taught. There were the histories of the secularization of American higher education by George Marsden and James Tungstead Birchall. In the light of these and dozens of other such studies, it must seem odd to take as one's model the prestigious universities. But that is what we did. In such universities, religious faith is considered to be either an impediment or irrelevant to the intellectual life. A believer presumably could flourish there only by bracketing his faith and becoming a practical apostate. The growing assumption was that excellence in the academic disciplines met criteria that had nothing to do with the truths of faith. It would be hard to find anything more antithetical to the assumptions of an O'Malley, a Nutting, a Ward, or a Maritain. I've always found it significant that when Bloom published his book, he exhibited no sense that things were otherwise elsewhere, unlike the earlier critiques of higher education made by Adler and Hutchins. By the time Bloom wrote, Catholic institutions were well down the road pointed to by John Tracy Ellis. And far from representing an alternative, they seem to replicate the academic situation lamented by Bloom. Ward had envisaged a Catholic university where theology was paramount, and in which all the disciplines were pursued in the ambience of the faith. Look back on now, his vision may seem quaint. What has being a Catholic university come to mean, by and large? That the liturgy is celebrated and that the obligation for social action is instilled in students. Important, indeed essential as these are, they do not seem to go to the heart of what a university formally is. Both of those can be conducted off campus. If religious faith no longer animates the work in the academic departments, we have, or threaten to have, a secularized university surrounded by, but uninfluenced by, worship and the faith that animates concern for our fellow man. The irrelevance of the faith to the intellectual and imaginative life threatens to become the practical assumption of our work. Concern for rankings is the manifestation of the assumption that all goes well in the presumed prestigious universities, and that being graded high by the criteria that govern them will bring excellence to Notre Dame. If my description of where we have come is at all accurate, it would of course be libelous to suggest that anyone set out to achieve this result. The result pursued was excellence, a goal difficult to criticize. But by defining excellence with reference to the so-called prestigious universities, we set ourselves on a path that assumes the irrelevance of faith to academic pursuits. The result is a tragic separation of culture and religion. There is another path, one that leads to the graves in Cedar Grove, or to those in the community cemetery, which bear the names of many of those I have mentioned, those who gave their lives to this university. In many ways, their efforts represent the capital on which we continue to draw. Are they and Orestes Brownson in the crypt rolling in their graves at what we have become? Perhaps, but there is another possibility. Recalling their vision of Notre Dame could provide the basis for the gradual return to a university whose Catholicism is not limited to the chapels and church and to the Center for Social Concern. But be of good cheer, because the Holy Ghost over the bent world broods with warm breast and with bright wings. Thank you.
Thank you, Ralph. Ralph has graciously allowed for quite a bit of time for questions. So, Ed?
I don't remember being that much influenced by John Tracy Ellis at the time you identify. When I was here as a student from 49 to 53, and then as a faculty member since 59, I have a sort of different picture about the road not taken. I see a Thomistic revival hampered by severe forms of factionalism that divided Toronto and Laval, that perhaps divided St. Louis University and Notre Dame. I see that factionalism dampening an effort which otherwise one might have expected to develop standards that would have rivaled those, the best in the nation. Instead of developing our own major league, we balkanized ourselves and failed to deal with each other in a straightforward and scholarly way. That sort of climate didn't bring out the best in us. That sort of climate was, in some sense, made possible because of the rather unfortunately authoritarian context within which the neo-scholastic revival was pushed. And all of that had, so far as I was concerned, and I wasn't concerned about #1 rankings or anything like that. I was concerned about not being parochial. I was concerned about conducting the kind of academic discussion that would rival Notre Dame's football schedule. That is, can we play with the best of them? Not that we adopt their game plan, but that we play an honest game, that we don't dismiss them categorically with pejorative titles of hostility to the faith, Now that sort of triad, factionalism, authoritarianism, parochialism, I think made us increasingly unattractive to our brothers in the theology department, who decided that their future lay with more intense analysis of Scripture and less emphasis on neo-scholastic movements in theology. So I guess if we're here as pathologists conducting a coroner's inquest, I think we need, that John Tracy Ellis is not a very plausible cause of death.
Thank you. This is Ed Manier, my colleague in the philosophy department. I think you're proving that two eyewitnesses of an accident come up with very different descriptions. But, you know, there is another way of looking at one of your points, and that's the factionalism. It's sometimes thought in retrospect that there was homogeneity in philosophy departments when there was a general predominance of Thomism. But as you point out, we had varieties of Thomism, and it was a very lively scene, and the competition between them turned on rather important philosophical issues, I think you'll agree. So there's another way of looking at that there might have been personal moral faults connected with that. But I, being a believer in original sin, even though my memory doesn't come up with any such instances, I would certainly agree that that might have happened. But thanks, Ed. I appreciate it. Well, I have another paper here that I...
Well, Ralph, I thought I might ask a question, if I may. I suppose one of the things I wonder in listening to your talk, and this may be a little bit more speculative and a little bit more imaginative in this sense, how do you think things might have gone, you know, had that road not been taken? I mean, Ellis's essay is really in a way a challenge, and that is, how do you manage to be intellectually serious and yet pursue that model that was being suggested?
Well, in part, I would say, in my own personal answer to that, I would think of many of the people that I referred to, and you could see how it happened, how it worked. It wasn't just a possibility. I mean, they talked always in terms of what might be, as Father Ward did, but he exemplified, it seemed to me, the kind of thing that he was urging, as Father Zahm had earlier. And the reason I mentioned the Homer recognition of Ward is that he was an inveterate attender of meetings, and everyone knew him, much as in more recent years everyone knows Father McMullen. That's the way Father Ward was. So I don't think it's a matter of pure speculation, just as in philosophy it's easy to, of course I picked kind of personal heroes and friends of mine to talk about. It's easy, and this was one of the burdens of that little book I mentioned that I wrote in '66, Thomism in an Age of Renewal. It's easy, all too easy, to pick out examples of bad philosophy teachers. I could give you an illustration of it right here, but it's easy to do that. And very often when people would talk about the courses that they had in philosophy, you get these sort of very negative appraisals, and I'm not saying they were inaccurate, but there were two things about it that struck me. One was the assumption that somewhere else things were a lot different. Well, those of us who'd gone to secular universities and so forth had no illusion that philosophy was being carried on at a uniformly exciting standard in all the classes there. So it seemed to me that what one ought to do is to look to the great representatives of a tradition and not at the trickle-down followers and so forth. And in the case of Catholic philosophy, we had the enormous examples of Etienne Gilson and Jacques Maritain. men who were not in any kind of a Catholic ghetto, for heaven's sake. These men were feted and invited all through the university system of this country and Europe and elsewhere. And they were honored and respected and had prestige for what they were, not by trying to do something in conflict with what they held. So there is an irony there. The very notion of prestige seemed to be to overlook the fact that there aren't many prestigious philosophers without, just generally speaking, secular or Catholic or believer. So why not look at the good example and note that, my gosh, we had quite a few. And they were doing all right, even on this sort of trivial, consequentialist prestige criterion. Huh?
Scott Moore.
Thank you, Ralph. Ralph, even today, we are still bedeviled by this quest for rankings and for notions of excellence and wondering where we get the criteria. It's absolutely clear that when we set our criteria for academic excellence, particularly at confessional, church-related schools, if we set that criteria by the U.S. News and World Report, we run huge risks in this pursuit. But it's also the case that most of our universities have mission statements with vacuous appeals to excellence and all areas. How do we establish or identify criteria for excellence which are not easily given over to self-delusion about what we've achieved or what we can achieve without selling the store away to our friends in the Ivies?
Fine, thanks, Scott. Scott Moore from Baylor. When I look back at the history that I just gave a kind of sounding in, one of the things that strikes me about that is that there was a good deal of debate and discussion going on and disagreement, or at least difference of emphasis, as indicated between Stritch and O'Malley, and so forth. It seems to me the way you do better what you're doing is to have that kind of interchange constantly going on. And you can do it intrinsically in terms of an understanding of what the goals of this university are, or a university that is governed by Christian belief, and constantly be striving for those. It's the fact that we're critical of one another that I think is the main guarantee of that. Guarantee might be a little strong, but it's at least a dispositional towards that. But there is something vulgar about asking how am I doing in terms of someone at Newsweek drawing up a list of colleges and universities. It's okay in football, maybe not this year, but it makes sense. There are kind of objective criteria, but there it's hard to know whether you would want to accept the criteria of appraisal without discussion, at least. Yeah, up above here, Mike.
Your reasoning as to why why perhaps Notre Dame and...
Are you talking down to me?
I'm sorry. Is that on?
That's probably all right. I just can't hear.
Okay. Maybe I'll just speak louder. I'm not sure. Is that on?
Yeah.
All right. Your reasoning as to why perhaps Notre Dame took this path and why many other colleges and universities took the path they did, namely this sort of prestige issue, reminds me of Joseph Epstein's comment that the definition of intellectual serenity is not giving a damn what Harvard thinks about it. And I've always liked that sort of thing. It seems as if that sort of intellectual serenity and sort of the taking up of this road not taken has been at least somewhat successful on smaller levels in sort of liberal arts colleges. I wonder if at universities like Notre Dame or the larger Catholic universities, about the possibility of recapturing this vision just due to the sort of largeness and impersonality of these institutions, which sort of, the departments sort of reproduce themselves and things like that. Isn't this going to take, I guess for loss of a better word, heavy administrative authority to do this? Is that the only way that a university could be turned back to a vision like this, or is there another way that's more grassroots, perhaps?
Yeah. Well, referring to those giants that I've mentioned before, Gilson and Maritain, and then to the somewhat lesser figures that were here that I mentioned, it seems to me one of the things that is essential for that is a robust faith. That is a non-apologetic attitude towards being a Catholic, towards being a Christian. I think that we have been influenced by this negative secularizing tendency to be a little ashamed of it, and to accept a kind of invitation to self-loathing, as if we're somehow settling for lesser standards and the like. If crystal clear standards were operative all across the board elsewhere, it would be a very different situation. But it's not my criticism of those other places that would matter, but the, as I say, shelf of books that has been devoted to this. I don't know any more melancholy book than Harold Bloom's The Western Canon, in which this man who has devoted his life to literature and to the works of the Western Canon confronts the fact that in his own discipline, English, there is the dismissal of any such appraisal of some books as better than others as being merely ideological. And his own defense of his preference for the great books is, I find, inadequate, because it sounds as if it's simply a preference. I was raised this way or something. And I was reminded of C.S. Lewis's remark, another professor of literature, who, when he converted, said that one of the bonuses of his conversion was that he shared the faith of the authors whose works he studied. And maybe that's one of the reasons for the attack on the Western Canon, the pervasive Christian ambience out of which so much of our literature, so much of our art, so much of our architecture, our music, and so forth has arisen. Maybe this is part of the animus against Western civilization. The antidote to that, I think, is a robust faith and gratitude for the faith rather than apologizing for it. And I think we do that almost unconsciously. It's not a matter of being triumphal, but being grateful. Yeah.
Michael Dauphiné.
Mike.
Thank you for a very helpful analysis of this kind of a reminiscence of 50 years. One question I had was that if we look at Excorde Ecclesiae, one of the things that the Pope seems to kind of focus on is the presence of Catholic faculty who are supportive of the mission, committed to the mission, and Catholic for Catholic University. Do you think that the drive for excellence, the drive to create a truly, an appreciation for American literary classics and things like that could have been done in a way that would have maintained a higher level of integrity if, at the very early stages in the 60s and 70s and 80s, a priority had been placed on, the recruitment of, as you put it, kind of unabashedly Catholic faculty members, maybe not exclusively, but at least a majority of Excorde. I guess, would that be sufficient, or is it also the fact that the objects of inquiry, the objects of scholarship, the objects of teaching that they would be oriented towards would also be explicitly Catholic?
Yeah, I think it has to be first subjective, because when we talk about that, there ought to be X number of Catholics on it. It's hardly an alarming proposition that Catholic universities ought to hire Catholic scholars, though, as you say, not exclusively. But it can't simply be a matter of turning in your baptismal certificate or something, an extrinsic kind of thing. What we want, it seems to me, is people who are doing their work animated by their faith. And this is not a project that is visionary because, as Ex Cordia Ecclesia reminds us, universities began as Catholic institutions. So it can't very well be a contradiction in terms, as has been suggested, since it's what has been is possible. But I would say, first of all, it's not a matter of just counting heads and this sort of thing. Then people would say, how do you know that they really believe something? Well, I don't know how do you ever know that. But what you want, how you guarantee it, are people whose robust faith is the source of what they do, and this guides the research projects that they undertake. It guides what they're looking for in their research, as is the case with anybody. But with the case of the Christian, it seems to me there's a whole set of presuppositions which ought to guide one's research. Now, clearly, as I indicated in the case of philosophy, Maritanne's description of Christian philosophy in that critique of Parmenides, which is a very important one. You don't want to fuse theology and philosophy. It's a matter of the ambience, the existential setting in which one does his work. But obviously, if you came up with an argument, one premise of which was an article of the faith, we would know that's a theological argument, and that isn't what we mean by Christian philosophy. You know? But it's what animates people. It's the moral. I mean, there is always a moral ambience of anything that we do. It seems to me that that's the analogy for the religious influence. What are the upshots of it? Well, Jules Sohn's Gifford Lectures, The Spirit of Philosophy in the Middle Ages, is a 2-volume effort to show the beneficial results of the influence of faith on philosophical development, an historian's argument. So again, these aren't, wouldn't it be nice if, or let's try to imagine some kind of science fiction scenario. There are factual, historical instantiations of it, and it seems to me one could take off from there. When Maritain and his wife became Catholics and then turned to philosophy, and so you find it all in this lovely book that John referred to. They started what they called the Cercle des Tout Thomistes, the Thomistic Study Circle. And in Maritain's notebook, you'll find the statutes of that particular group. And what the emphasis was, and it was the emphasis of Maritain's life, and it seems to me it was what characterized Catholic philosophers in my youth, that there is a close and necessary relationship between the pursuit of holiness and the pursuit of truth. And if you look at these heroes of ours, like Maritain and Jules Sohn, I mean, they were edifying people. Earthy in the case of Jules Sohn, but their intellectual life was embedded in a spiritual life. And it seems to me that's what we're talking about when we talk about Catholic intellectuals. How do you order them up? I don't know. You provide these models, I think, and say, think about that. Yeah.
Over here. Dr. McInerney, it's beyond Notre Dame. It seems as if out there in smaller colleges and universities, Christendom, Aquinas, in California, there's an emphasis on holiness, while at the same time the mental disciplines, philosophy, rhetoric, logic, grammar. What will be the impact of these small organic movements on the whole as compared to Notre Dame, Georgetown, and the big universities?
Mm-hmm. Well, I think you need all of these sizes and levels and interpretations of what Catholic higher education is. I'm a great fan of Thomas Aquinas, but it's not for everybody. It's not for everybody. But it does what it does excellently well. And they, by following their own drummers, have received the kind of reception that I think John Tracy Ellis was longing for. But that wasn't their purpose. That wasn't their purpose. It was a byproduct of what they're doing. But in many respects, I think the kind of scholar I'm talking about is probably in diaspora in the larger Catholic universities, as he is in secular universities. That should be said. So it's maybe it's always been this way. I don't know. It would be when you look back and you see the sort of disputes that went on here. Obviously, there wasn't homogeneity, and maybe you always have to have. I selected people. There are a lot of people I wouldn't have mentioned that I've known over by a half century here. May they rest in peace. But I wouldn't want to bring them forward in the way that I brought these. I could have brought forward more than I did. So I'm babbling, but I wouldn't want to say, gee, we all ought to send our kids to Thomas. I'm on the board out there, Thomas Aquinas College, but some kids ought to go there. But I have always, when parents come and talk to me about their kids coming to Notre Dame and they're concerned about their faith and so forth, I've never hesitated to urge them to come here. All my kids went to Notre Dame. Danny's the only washout, but they all went here. He's not a washout. But I never hesitated. So it's not as if one wishes things had pursued another path, that you would say what we're here for cannot be done. Of course it can be.
Over here. When I was in graduate school, my wife and I had a neighbor who was able to get a play produced in New York City, and so we went down to see it. And it was quite fascinating and seemed terribly profound. And we thought how lucky that we're neighbors to the person who wrote it. So we went back and said, what does this mean? Clearly you're after something very deep. What is it? And he said, oh, I had no idea. I just wanted to look like I was after something very deep in the play. That's why I wrote it, to appear as though I were talking about something important, although I had nothing really to say. And this is, I wonder if the problem that we're facing is the whole notion of, instead of pursuing truth, trying to get some kind of outside judgment to validate oneself. It seems to me that my playwright friend, whether he was trying to impress Catholics or trying to impress atheists, if he had nothing really to say, that was the emptiness. So, but the problem is, how do we escape from the need to have some kind of external validation? How can we think that truth itself is enough? I mean, it's kind of frightening to not have some sort of body which certifies us and says that we're good. It seems to me maybe that's the problem, that whether it's a Catholic body or a secular body, where do we get that courage? Where do we get that fidelity?
Yeah, it is. You mentioned pursuit of truth. One of the remarkable features of Fides et Ratio is that it seems to me to be as much a defense of reason as it is of faith. And those of us in philosophy know that there are rather prominent exponents of the view that anything like a statement that what I say reflects the way things are or doesn't reflect the way things are, that both of those are just no-no. So the whole assumption that the human mind is made to know the things that are has been under some sort of siege, I think, since Descartes. And if you look at the Thomistic revival, that's one of the main reasons it was there. And if you look at Maritain's notion of what his vocation as a Christian philosopher was, it was mainly to save the intellect, to save the intellect. That is, as a capacity to grasp the way things are. That's been under attack. So when you think of entering into disputes, very often the best argument seemed to me to be reductionis ad absurdum, that the position is not a tenable alternative so much as a rejection of the obvious, which appeals to what it rejects in the very statement of it. So to speak. So it would be, I don't want to sound apocalyptic, but if you read certain contemporary philosophers, you would figure the whole ball game is over in terms of talking about truth, except in some kind of thin, pragmatic sense, which doesn't really wash either, I don't think, in that context. So it's, when I think of that, I mean, it's and you think of prestige, you want to consider the source. I mean, would you really want to be honored or applauded by people who would share in this kind of anti-intellectualism, relativism, kind of nihilism that some people espouse without any trepidation, with a certain amount of chic, as a matter of fact. Huh? So that's not an answer, just an effusion. Yeah.
I mean, it seems to me, even if one is writing to please the Pope, that one is taking one's mind off the thing that one cares, the reality, the truth, and as one is standing out, is no longer related to the object of knowledge, but just trying to imagine some external judgment. It seems to me that's what one has to get away from. Yeah. It's not that we're pleasing the wrong people, but we shouldn't be trying to please anyone just to say what's right.
No, that's what led Willis Nutting into the church. That recognition. It's kind of hard to have a conversation with someone on that basis, isn't it? I mean, the very possibility of a conversation seems to be taken away. I don't favor having a wholly negative or apocalyptic critique of what's going on in non-Catholic or non-Christian colleges and universities. But I'm disposed to think that things are pretty bad there on the basis of what one reads by people who have been, who have spent their much of their careers in them. So that, again, it seems to me ironic to elevate institutions which are described that way by people in them as models and criteria for what we're trying to do here. Again, I'm not answering it. Maybe I can't. Yeah.
I think we can perhaps have the last question over here.
Okay.
Dr. McInerney, I wanted to ask about a little bit more about Jacques Maritain and his notion of Christian philosophy.
I can't hear you too well. That's not your fault. But
I'm sorry. I wanted to ask about Jacques Maritain and his notion of Christian philosophy. I was reading his book, Moral Philosophy, which was the last book he wrote, and couldn't really make much sense of it, especially his criticisms of Aristotle and his concluding chapter, until I read his books from the 20s and 30s on Christian philosophy and on science and wisdom. And his notion of moral philosophy there seems to be a little stronger than at least you put it, I think. He seems to think that moral philosophy cannot operate outside of the faith. And if it does, it produces necessarily a false moral philosophy. And so he has this notion of moral philosophy adequately considered. Is that how you read it? And also, doesn't that make any sort of discussion with secularists impossible?
No, that's a danger. Maritain talked very differently as time went on about moral philosophy than he did about theoretical philosophy, and he developed a notion of what he called moral philosophy adequately considered, which had to be subalternated, a kind of a technical scholastic term, to moral theology in order to be true. Why? Because we are called to a supernatural end, and any advice about what we ought to do is obviously advising us on how to achieve our fulfillment. If it doesn't mention the supernatural end, then he would regard that as falsified. This is very much like Gilson's critique of Dante, as a matter of fact, and he accuses him of not being a philosopher because he holds that there is a twofold end of human action, as indeed Dante does. But as has happened, so does Thomas Aquinas in the Prima Secunda. So I think I would differ from Maritain on this. I understand the motivation, but I think what you're saying, and it's the fear that people have about Christian philosophy, that it could only be cogent for one, the argument could only be cogent for one who shared the faith. That would be defective philosophy, no doubt about it. Yeah. Okay.
Well, I hope you will join me in thanking this marvelous model of a tradition.